Would you like to experience a shift in your career? You may be frustrated to see the same workplace patterns repeat or feel that work lacks purpose, respect, or compensation. To get relief, you may have talked with friends or family, read books, watched YouTube, or taken courses. All good strategies if you get unstuck quickly and move towards your goal. But if you're frustrated with your progress, you need an expert guide to become the hero of your own work story. And that's where I come in. My name is Marie Gervais, and I help people move from work trauma to career transformation. With a doctorate in culture and learning in the workplace, certification in emotional freedom coaching, and as a training and development professional, I've helped hundreds of stuck career professionals gain new insights and release what is not serving them. So if you're ready to turn wishful thinking into a meaningful, well-compensated career and are hungry to experience the power of coaching to get you there, let's talk. Get a taste of what career success could be for you. Go to trycoaching.link/biz. Biz is spelled B-I-S. See you there. Hello, Culture and Leadership Connections podcast listeners. Today, I am happy to present to you Sophie Wade, who is a work futurist, international keynote speaker, author of Empathy Works, which is her second book, and an authority on the future of work issues as they present themselves. She is a work futurist who is the host of the widely popular Transforming Work podcast and has had over 500,000 learners take her 4 LinkedIn courses, which cover empathy, future of work skills, and Gen Z. Sophie is the founder and workforce innovation specialist at Flexcel Network, a future of work consultancy, where she helps organizations transform, adapt, and update their work environments so that they can attract, engage, and retain their multi-generational and distributed talent. Welcome, Sophie.
It's so nice to be here. Thank you for having me.
Sophie, that was your formal business achievements bio. Tell us a little bit about yourself, your family, where you're from, just a little bit to get to know you better.
So I have 2 kids and 2 dogs. I also used to have 2 chinchillas and 2 rats as well. So I love animals. I am originally English. I'm American as well. I've lived all over the world and worked all over the world as well, which is a big part of who I am. And this is my second career. My first career was sort of more in strategy and finance. And this is really interesting, very much engaged in the business world, but with a more sort of psychological angle.
A psychological angle. How did you become interested in business and psychological angles working together?
Well, it certainly didn't occur to me that that's where it was going to go, but it was more when I had my second child was sort of 3 years old and started having a voice and was kind of complaining that I wasn't around as much. And I was working full time and just didn't have time at the end of the day. I was working full time in the office, getting back late, 7 o'clock. And at the weekends, I was rushing around trying to get everything else done. And that was when I really sort of thought about workplace flexibility. This is 2010 and first got into that space. And then as you're sort of really understanding about workplace flexibility and what that means, and I started asking, particularly women at the time, actually, if you could design the perfect job, if you and helping people come back into the workplace, if they've been sort of out looking after kids and stuff like that, I started seeing how much psychology was based in whether people had confidence, whether people had understood the language that they needed to get updated with. Or as I'm trying to now in the future workspace and talking about empathy, using words very specifically that are going to resonate and land with the people I'm talking to. And the resistance that I find in some of adapting for the new ways that work in the new era of work in order to connect the ideas or the data that I'm bringing, I need to be empathizing with, I need to be understanding the psychology of the person that I'm talking to. So that has been the sort of fascinating aspect of it. It's not just what the data says, it's how that is going to actually, resonate and connect with the person who is looking to try and sort of work out how can I adapt and sort of update my business for the future of work.
Right. Well, data has never really changed people's hearts.
Very true.
So you didn't start out in this, though. You must have grown up somewhere and you must have had some kind of family experience. So what was that like for you?
Yes, I grew up in England, in London, and my father worked for the BBC for 25 years. And my mother was a school teacher in a deprived area in London. And both of their experiences had a lot of impact on me in terms of the conversations that we had, the things that we talked about, the variety of discussions. My father was actually editor of Tomorrow's World, which was a live science program for kids, in fact, but really looked at a wide range of issues. And the BBC obviously being something that was an entity, particularly then, which was always trying to expand people's viewpoint and look at different angles and look at different perspectives. So that really did inform the conversations that we had. And I think give me a background to always be expanding my knowledge and being curious about the world and learning.
That would have made you intellectually curious, socially curious, psychologically curious, all the things you talked about earlier, because you had a family platform in which these things were coming up all the time, right?
Very much so. And, my mother was teaching 5 to 7-year-olds in Shepherd's Bush in London, which was, in her classes in a state school, a public school, were filled, often 40 kids. And most of them didn't speak English as a first language. So it was extremely challenging environment. And she talked to us a lot, to my sister and me, a lot about the different backgrounds that people came from, the different situations that were challenging, 5 kids in a one-room apartment, these type of things. So these were things that she's extraordinarily empathetic. And so we had a lot of discussions about what the world was like and the opportunities and challenges for people in all types of environments and situation.
Did you then also participate in or in some way become immersed in those experiences, or was it on a discussion level?
We actually had one of the kids stay with us for a couple of weekends. The boy had never seen a cow, and my mother really wanted to help him see a cow. And he was the 5th kid out of 5, and he was really not taken care of by his mother, or she had so many other things going on. It was very challenging. And so we really, lived that experience. And I, went a good number of times to the school and to meet the kids. And so I knew, who some of these kids were, because, I wasn't too distant in age at the time when she was teaching them.
So that gave you sort of a face and an experience and a person to put with the stories that you were hearing, right?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And we also traveled a lot because my father was working on a children's program. He got 5 or 6 weeks off during the summer, and we went camping. We never stayed in hotels. We had 2 little mountain tents, and we drove everywhere. So we drove all through France. We spent lots of time in Italy and France. We even drove to Greece and once to Turkey. Sometimes we stayed up mountains, sometimes camping wild by rivers. Those are really wonderful experiences because being for much longer periods of time in different environments and getting the bread from the local shop and, going to the butcher and then sort of camping. And then you also met a lot of different people in camping sites because you don't have hotel room doors and walls to shut people off. So these are very, very interesting and real experiences that affected me. And swimming in freezing mountain rivers and pools was also something my father was challenged my sister and me with.
Sounds like a really interesting life experience that you had as a child.
It was. It really was. And that sort of set me up. I did do science A-levels with art to keep me sane, but I didn't want to do any more science when I went to university. And so I actually chose to do Chinese. In England, it's you do one subject, and I didn't want to do either maths or physics or chemistry. And so there aren't that many options for you. Actually, one of my distant cousins had gone mad in China twice. And so I was like, oh, this sounds very interesting. My mother studied Russian at university and my father studied Arabic. And so I was like, he said, how about Chinese? I was like, oh, that sounds really interesting. And I thought, well, if I don't want, if I don't enjoy doing it, when I can always change. But I absolutely loved it. So I studied Chinese at university, which was the history, culture, philosophy, poetry, and language. Although at Oxford, it was treated as a dead language. It isn't now, but it was treated as a dead language. But I did focus on learning that as a live language too.
Interesting. So are you fluent in Chinese, in Mandarin maybe?
I can still speak, depending on the vocabulary, because if you don't have the vocabulary, you really can't talk about that particular subject. But right. I certainly, it's workable. I live in Soho near Chinatown, so I hear the words around me a lot, which is nice. And sometimes a word will sort of pop into my head. And I'm like, oh, look, it's still there somewhere. So I know that there's a base level in there. I have done some work in the prior 10 years or 15 years where it has caused me to go to China and do some work in China So there's a base level there, but I was definitely better at it than I am now.
So I'm just really intrigued by your life experience. So I've been asking you all these extra questions from my usual ones, but maybe you could share a couple of incidents from your childhood that you think were really formative, that stand out for you even now.
Well, I would say that actually even not so much the childhood, but the elements that I've spoken about very much were formative, which caused me then, after studying Chinese, to want to go and use it. I love theory, but I like to get very practical. So I did go to work in Hong Kong, and I lived and worked in Hong Kong in total about 5 years, because I find that the Chinese culture is absolutely fascinating, and it's a very deep and rich and long culture, and it's very, very, very different to the English culture in many ways, although there are similarities as well. And it was one particular situation that I do remember very well. I don't actually remember whether it was in Hong Kong or Taiwan, because I had to study in Taiwan as part of my course. And I was sitting there all, English and prim and proper, and sitting with my back up straight and trying to get the rice out of my bowl into my mouth and making a big mess, and all the rice was going everywhere, where everybody else was sort of bent down over their bowls and sort of shoveling sounds the wrong word, but sort of like scooping the rice with their chopsticks into their mouth and not making a mess. And I had thought that there are certain sort of objective truths, right? There are certain things which are the same everywhere. And somehow I thought that, because I'm having traveled a lot, there were lots of things which are different, but I had thought that some of the things, which sounds kind of silly, but like etiquette, was sort of normally, they were like, it was relatively the same everywhere. And I realized then that that's not the case. And so even some of the basic building blocks of our culture and our civilization, all the stuff that I knew was just what I knew. It was just my local environment. And so it was like the first step in a huge sort of epiphany for me in terms of a very, very different culture. It also was about reincarnation and how the Chinese value losing an old person so much more than like losing a baby. They're kind of like, well, because of reincarnation, they're going to come back again. I mean, that's really sad, but they will come back. But for an old person, they're losing all this knowledge and wisdom. And it was a very different way that in the West that we look at life and don't think about reincarnation in that way necessarily. And so that was really impactful to me, to just looking at my world differently, and my world kind of like expanded to be really open to so many more experiences, so much more understanding. And then I also started to see connections between, for example, when I was traveling around China, often they would say to me, oh, no, you're English, 英国人, and that's England. And they go, oh, 贵族. And 贵族means noble race. And what they mean by that is long culture. You're like us, you have a long history and culture. And they automatically were trying to make a sort of point of connection. So there was a point of connection there. And then many other things were different. The Italian culture, for example, the focus on the first child, the focus on the very big family and everybody eating around the same table. So I started seeing similarities between cultures that I hadn't necessarily, and more differences between cultures that had seemed much more similar to me. So it was a huge awakening for me in terms of what the world meant and how different and similar people are.
Well, when you were talking about your childhood, people kind of came to you and they were in the English culture. And so you could discover things to a certain extent. But it was when you went to China that you had this awakening, that you saw that you were just a part of this whole big puzzle of humanity, and that there were so many other things to discover from the perspective of those actual experiences rather than from the perspective of, I have the norm. I think you moved out of your norm.
Well, yes. I mean, I spent quite a good portion of time, and I have relatives who are French, but, France and Italy are much more similar to England. So it's kind of like variations on the same theme, whereas China was a whole different ball of wax.
Totally different. And
that was what really caused me to kind of go, oh, there are very, very different types of environment and ways of looking at the world. And so that was a really very interesting experience for me and very valuable. And I'm always saying to anybody I can, like, if you have the opportunity, live outside your country, not just visit, that you can't really get a sense of it. But once you live outside of your country and you see your country from the outside and you live in somebody else's culture and environment, it really changes how you see the world and understand yourself.
No kidding. Such an important point. It's more important to do that than to fear what would happen if you go to another country. It's more like go to the other country so you can see things differently.
Yeah. And there'll be many things which are similar or the same that would be very surprising. And other things that where your differences that you also didn't expect. And I love to learn, and I'm so curious about, what's down this side street, what's down there, what's going on. And so that's why actually one of the reasons that I love living in a different country is because it really heightens that level of learning and absorbing new experiences that sort of feeds me, really.
Yes. Well, also because you're open to it.
Yes. True.
So you were born into an interesting family. You were born in England, in London, into a particular time and place. And you're a woman, you're white, you have, this whole sort of environment around you of being English speaking. All of that has somehow shaped your sense of culture and self. Then you've added other things onto it. But let's look a little bit about what influenced you and continues to influence you from the roots you were born into.
Yes. So my grandfather on my mother's side is Russian, and on my father's side, there are extraordinary man who is actually my grandmother's cousin. He was Belgian and he fought for the resistance during the war. He was at Dachau for 3 years. He was captured during the war. And he was actually a key founder in terms of the International Baccalaureate. So I always sort of thought of myself as a mutt. I don't feel English. I do feel English in some ways. I support the underdog. I really believe in fairness. I love silly humor. But I feel generally that sort of a member of this planet, and really have always felt deeply connected to the different elements of my family. My mother actually went to university. My grandmother was extraordinary. She sort of said, "Oh, you've been at school in England too long. You should go and study." And took her to Paris, and she actually went to university at the Sorbonne in Paris, and then went to interpreting school. And so there's been a very international flavor to my family always. So that's a sort of foundation to how I view the world. So it's always been sort of undefined, and I've loved that. And I really sort of, I guess, leaned into that in terms of how I either define myself or choose not to define myself as being sort of this or that. And because I've lived all over the world, my accent is very fluid. Some people kind of, "Oh, you're English," or maybe you're South African or Australian. And I love the fact that I can't necessarily be defined. And perhaps I like that because I find that certainly in England, I am not a fan of the class system at all. And I find it is so rigid. You can't change it. You're born into whatever you're born into, and that's it. But if I'm living in another country, I have more freedom to be whoever I am. So I really sort of resist the fact, I resist boxes defining anybody, defining people by how, anybody by how they look, their gender, their race, whatever it might be. So that's kind of like the lens that contributed to who I am, has been a lot to do with the sort of international view of the world and the experiences that I then went on to have as a result.
So you really had this is the whole world and I'm a part of it, cosmopolitan view from the beginning because of your family experiences and the traveling, and just all of that contributed to your sense of who you were in the world. A perfect springboard for jumping into the future of work world.
Yes, that really does sort of define who I am. And the fact that I then lived and worked in different countries, I chose to go to a very international business school, one that is it's called INSEAD. It's just outside Paris. And people from every nation, there were 14 Spaniards and 11 Israelis, and the English and French contingents are the largest, but there's still only sort of 40 people of what at the time was a promotion of about 240. So, and that community for me has been a strong community for me as I've grown up. My closest friends who I was living with was a Spanish woman, Swiss, German, Lebanese, Irish Lebanese, and so that only sort of cemented the community that I felt a part of. And also the sort of being able to have more understanding of each of the different countries. So then when I was living in different countries, Hong Kong, obviously, Germany, a little bit of time in Italy, France for business school, and now the US, I was also working in those countries, not in France, but working in those countries, and working in different countries and getting the different experiences and work culture that different countries have. The work culture in Germany is very different to here. And, the beginning and the end of the day, whether you work at weekends, absolutely you do not work at weekends. That really helped me sort of have a much more open view to how work should be. there isn't necessarily how work should be because every country has a very different attitude towards it. So that, is part of why I am where I am, because of the different experiences I've had working around the world as well.
Instead of how work should be, how work could be.
Yeah.
Given the variety of human experiences with work, what might be something intentional that we could do to create a workplace culture that would be able to respond to those different realities and still be true to wherever it is located geographically?
Yes, and it's more for me about the people who are involved in a particular company and the way they're operating and the business they're operating, much less than the actual culture of the country. I mean, when I was working in Germany, I was working in an early internet startup, and the only people who did work, or generally the people who worked beyond 9 to 5, because that is certainly then was very much the culture of the country. They worked very hard during that time, were the techies, and they would be the ones who would be working over the weekend, sort of similar to developers all over the world. And, working on site, whether it was on sort of side projects because it was so interesting and fascinating, or on our own business, which was sort of growing and very, very interesting because it was such early days. So I think what you're working on and how you're working is really about the human-centric approach, which is where I sit very squarely these days, and really trying to understand who the people are, the employees are, the contractors that you may have, and to get the most out of them is going to require really helping them do their best work, helping them understand what their work preferences are, what their work styles are, and that is specific to people rather than countries, I think.
Well, workplaces have their own culture. Any two people talking together within a minute have already started to establish cultural norms between the two of them. So every workplace, every department.
For sure.
But then there are also desires to have a certain standardization of the culture. Like if you take IBM, for example, there's IBM all over the world, but IBM has a certain type of culture that's recognizable across countries, even though in each country there are variants of it.
Absolutely. So in terms of workplace culture, yes, a team can have a culture, a regional office will have a certain culture, as well as trying to help people connect through common cultural elements and values, which are so much more important now, or so much more focused on now that we are noticing that we're working so much more flexibly and in sort of hybrid arrangements and things like that. And that heightened awareness of culture and the importance and value of culture, I think, is very beneficial.
So now that you have had all these different experiences and you're older, you're not a child anymore, what are some of the things that you have made more common practice that you adopted from different cultures that you were a part of? It could be professional cultures, can be ethnic or national cultures, or it could be interest cultures, for example, some kind of interest or hobby that you're interested in. For example, one of my podcast guests has an interest in supporting bees around the world and has joined the feral bee culture, which is international and also has really interesting local flavor. So bees are quite diverse. They aren't all the same. And so if people keep killing the bees that aren't the ones that they recognize as being bees, then we eventually have nothing to eat because the bees are so necessary for pollination. And he said this has really influenced the way he leads, this whole immersion in the culture of preserving bees. So I thought I'd just throw that at you and say, what influences have you brought into your life from other groups?
Well, I love that. My aunt Lorna would be absolutely passionate about, who is passionate about bees and very concerned about bees. So she will definitely appreciate that gentleman. I think one thing that I bring from all the experiences I've had is trying not to make any assumptions about the other person. Really, I mean, it has brought me into the world of empathy as being an understanding of other people and recognizing my own context from the epiphany that I had, which is my norm is only what I know. And so trying not to make assumptions about whether I actually understood what the person really meant to say, or, where they're coming from, what their context is. And the States is a melting pot of people. It's incredibly diverse. And so, when we're talking about everybody bringing their full self to work, well, we haven't been ready for that. And so trying to make sure that I am as open as possible to trying to understand understand whoever it is that I'm dealing with, and creating that environment where people are able to be their full selves and be comfortable talking about whatever it might be. I care a lot about diversity and inclusion and advocating for that as an ally from my position. And those are some elements of where I come from in a leadership position, and also in so much of the work that I do in the workplace, and how things are evolving with a new era of work where we're working at a faster pace. We're needing to work much more closely together as people, on projects and teams, which never used to be the case. And that raises the bar on how challenging some of our workplace situations, because the more people we put together and working together at a faster pace, under more stress, under difficult economic conditions, that raises the levels of engagement that employees need to bring in order to be effective, to help the business move forward in a sustainable way. And so that really trying to bring that understanding of the more that we can understand each other, the better all the outcomes are going to be.
Yes, I think you're speaking about suspending judgment as long as possible and being curious to find out what's really going on with people and who they really are and what they are bringing to the table. So rather than to assume that you know, or to assume that you understand them. Did I get that right?
Yes, exactly. And I think language, the English language, there's that funny comment with England and the States, we're two countries separated by a common language. But having lived in countries where, German as a language is incredibly structured and, Italian is very fluid. But in many ways, Chinese and English are not very easily compatible as languages. That really brings another level of, need to understand. For example, it's very difficult to put the downside scenarios in a Chinese contract because that's bad luck.
Right.
So that's a problem.
You mean like for risk assessment?
Yes. Like if this were to happen, this is what needs to happen. Like they don't
just
want that
speaking about it is bad luck.
Yeah. And if you're putting it in writing,
that's like same in a lot of African cultures.
Really?
Yeah. It's the idea that saying something unpleasant, it causes it to happen.
It's so fascinating.
Yeah.
So at one point I was negotiating a contract with a gentleman who was an American born Chinese, absolutely Superman. And we were negotiating the contract. At some point, he said, I needed to put in a clause, which was, if we are no longer aligned on strategy, then. And he suddenly, it was just got to a very difficult, very contrarian discussion. It was it was bad. And I suddenly sort of stopped and I said, please excuse me, but is this a cultural thing? And he said, yes. Now, luckily, the co-CEOs of the company that I was working for both had spent a good amount of time in China. And I said to them, where we are right now, this clause either goes out or we lose this guy. And I think it's a cultural issue. And I think we can live with it. And they both...
Or what would the Chinese do instead?
It's based on the relationship, and that's why it takes longer in many situations to build the relationship.
It's not the contract is not important. It's the relationship that you've built.
Exactly. And both my CEOs said, we got it. We love him. We're good with that. And the relationship was fantastic. We signed the contract without that particular clause in it. But these can be very, very challenging issues, which without the sort of cultural awareness and, without the relationship necessarily, you're going to either will be able to have the kind of, move forward on the business. And I think there's a lot of discussion between, say, generations. I was at a conference a few years ago, and the gentleman who was running the conference was talking. He's a boomer, and he was talking to a millennial actually in the audience. And there's some back and forth and some level of potentially misunderstanding or misinterpretation. And he suddenly said, hey, look, for a second, tell me exactly what comes first to your mind when I say this with the next phrase. Okay. The guy was like, okay, fine. He said, lifelong employment. And the millennial said, well, of course I'm going to be working all my life. And I was like, oh my goodness. I had a completely different reaction to that particular phrase. And I've actually used that phrase in that example with somebody else who is also a millennial or older Gen Z and got the same reaction. So when we have a very different, so obviously, lifelong employment to me means you have a job all your life, one job. And so when these sort of normal hard work, lifelong employment, a lot of these phrases that we believe that we know what it means, or we know what it means to us or me, that if we are actually speaking at cross purposes to somebody from a different culture, from a different context, from a different age group, that's where a lot of misunderstandings are going to happen. And it has very much sort of anchored in the culture of the person, of their background, whatever it might be. But when we need more clarity, we need to try and understand each other's cultural context and work context. And I think that is where I think, a lot more of this human understanding can be helpful.
I think it's really important to increase understanding and perception, but it still leaves you stuck. I have 3 problems for you.
Okay, great.
And I'll bet you can help me out with them.
I hope so.
Yeah. One, it seems extremely trivial, but it's a constant source of irritation to me. And that is that. So I have a calendar booking app, which I use, and I put the link in. And there are people across the generation. So it's not millennial or boomer, or it's people across the generations who refuse to click on it and choose the date. So they will go back and forth and say, well, what's your day? Or send me your calendar for the week, or send me your calendar for the month. And I'm going, just click on the link and it'll show it to you. And they refuse to click on the link. And I say, okay, well, here's my calendar for the week. Here's my calendar for the day. And I hate doing it because it's such a waste of time. And I have not found any way to get around that practical misunderstanding. And I've tried to think, is this because some people, but I'm older and I'm using all sorts of apps. And these are millennials who are refusing. I was trying to find what the patterns would be, but it can go across the board. So I've actually been starting to track it and say, okay, the people who refuse to click on the link, where do they fall in the age spectrum and in the culture spectrum? And it doesn't seem to be related to culture or age. It seems to be personality. It really wastes my time, and I'm not sure how to deal with it. So do you have an idea?
A couple of things. So one is, I think this is where all of this comes down to. It's bound down to the individual. I am wondering how good Calendly is, because I always click on a link for Calendly, for example, on my laptop, and I can see it very easily. I don't know what Calendly looks like if I were to be clicking it on my phone.
Oh, it's nice on the phone. It's even better on the phone, actually.
It's even better on a phone.
Mm-hmm.
So I would ask in a non-contrarian way, just to say, is there a different calendar app that you prefer? Is it the app that isn't great? Just to get more understanding of what it is, because usually there is a reason. For example, I have an issue when people always send me Google Calendar invites, which is great. That's great. And I click on it and it pops into my calendar, but I use iCal so that it doesn't send them an acceptance back, the person an acceptance back, which is often why I actually write back and I say, by the way, I did get it, because I had somebody who thought I wasn't doing, joining a meeting or actually joining an interview because I clicked, but it didn't go back. So there may be some technical issue. They just prefer a very different app. I don't know. And I would start asking the question to find out, to see what the issue might be. If you're finding, what percentage of people is it?
It's probably about 30%.
30? Wow.
Yeah. Okay. So that's a small one. I think the idea, when I can get them on the phone or on a Zoom meeting, then of course I can ask them about the app. So that might be my next step in my research on this.
But I don't think you'd even have to be on the call. You could just write back and sort of say, sure, I'm just wondering, if it's a different app, just in the response back, again, not kind of like, why aren't you responding?
It's usually the people who are afraid of links. So far, I found that they don't want to click on a link because they're worried it might take them somewhere they don't want to go because they didn't choose the link. It's not something they would looked up themselves. Or it could be that they don't use apps and they just think that there's a way, only the way to do it is the way they do it, which is to go back and forth 20 emails to decide on a date.
Right.
Anyway, that's a small trivial thing. But here's another one that's bigger. And that is that I'm interviewing people in a small town here that has had an influx of immigrants coming to work, and they face multiple problems. One is housing, and another one is prejudice. And then there are also things that they have difficulties with, like public transportation. So they wanted me to interview people, find out what some of the issues are, and then write some guidebooks. But I found a whole bunch of things that were not what they were expecting. So one thing was I found where the support networks were and who was happy to move there, and how the people that stayed, why did they stay? And, how did businesses develop? So that was really interesting. But then the other thing I found out is about cultural disconnects that don't solve. So let's take a hotel, for example. So the owner of the hotel, who is herself of Japanese ancestry, so first generation born to Japanese parents. And, they have multiple hotels and go out of their way to hire people from different cultures and also from the indigenous community around them. So there are several indigenous communities where they go out of their way to hire. So they have a whole variety of people that are there. But they found that the groups in between each other get certain animosities based on behaviors that they see as being cultural, but they don't like. So if there is a death in an indigenous community, everybody just doesn't show up at work. They all attend the funeral, and there may be 2 days worth of the funeral. And so then that leaves the Filipino culture baffled about why nobody said they weren't coming, because they didn't know there was a death in the community. I mean, it wouldn't have been within their circle. Mm-hmm. So that they just see that people don't show up for work and they have to cover other people's shifts.
Right.
So that's one example of a disconnect, but there are several because they have 4 or 5 different cultural groups and they're constantly angry with one group or the other because of something that they understand to be cultural, but they don't understand how to get past the inconvenience that it causes when people do something that is a workplace problem.
Right. Well, I would say that each of the cultural groups probably has their own days that they're not in the office because of specific, religious, or the Day of the Dead, which I think the Philippine community.
That'd be Hispanic, probably.
Yes, there's Mexican, but there's also a similar one, I think, that I remember from Hong Kong. The Chinese certainly have one, the Day of the Ghosts, which is sometime in October, November. So what I mean,
the Chinese New Year, for one thing, would be good for Chinese.
Well, the Chinese New Year. So each culture has their own number of days. So I think when there can be more sharing of information about when these days are, so that they can be covering for each other. So
you can do that if it's a predictable day, but you can't do it when there is a death in the community.
For sure. But I think when there's more openness and sharing of information, that starts to then increase the sharing of a death that comes along, because yes, we understand, we respect that there's a death that comes along, and there's going to be something else that comes along in our community, which, may be more random because you don't know when that's going to happen. But that with the sharing of that information, there can be a sort of a heads up, we're going to need some covering when these kind of things happen, when they can be. So that there is a sort of sense of equitability across the different groups, because it's not that I don't want to respect your cultural norms because I want you to respect mine. It's a question of when those are. It's not about inconvenience, just sort of reframing it in terms of, let us know, we want to be there to support you. And just like we want you to support us in our particular situations and during our particular days. So I think trying to turn it so that it's much more of we're all being respectful of and supporting each other's cultural norms and days. And so we can have a heads up in terms of ones that aren't on the calendar.
Listening to you, it occurred to me there that it can also just be a question of a workplace norm being established. So, for example, if an emergency comes up in your life, your family, or your community, this is the protocol to follow so that the workplace is informed. And this is why, right? So if that discussion helped provide a unity of thought around how to communicate emergencies, for example.
And it's unlikely on one team you're going to have everybody in that team is going to be, let's just say, of one particular culture. So when they work together and they are, have strong relationships, bring some of those tensions down, then that filling in for each other says kind of like, okay, I'll support you here, I'll fill in for you there, but, give us a heads up. So that protocol is within the team as well as the company, because it's across the teams that they need to fill in for each other. So yeah, I think that's exactly the way to go.
Mm-hmm. So you've answered most of the questions I normally would ask in the things that you've said, so I'm not going to ask them a second time. But we're getting close to the end of the interview, and I have a couple of more questions to ask you. And one of them is, if you were to give people the heads up, as you said earlier, a heads up about what brings out the best in you, in Sophie Wade, what kind of work conditions or attitudes or behaviors bring out the best in you?
Being straight with me. I am a really direct person. You what you see is what you get. I really hidden agendas. I find troubling because you can sort of sense that there's something else going on. So being open and direct with me. Somebody said to me that I have strong opinions held lightly. So I will push back. I have a strong opinion, and I may push back and sort of argue and debate you a lot, but I will go away and I'll think about it, and I may come back, and next time you see me, I may have, incorporated or adjusted how my point based on that data because you really believed in what you said. So, not to be put off by how I speak or the opinions I have, because I'm try and be very, very thoughtful about it. So being direct, saying what you think, and I abhor lying, really abhor lying. So just have it and having an open mind. And when I can see that somebody is coming with an open mind to what I have to say, what others have to say, to looking at data, to looking at the experiences that we're dealing with, to, how we're going to cope with what's going on in the future. Because I just do see that, whether it's called a growth mindset or an open mindset, that I see as being the most helpful way to move forward in a productive way. And that really is going to get the most out of me, because then I get really excited about kind of like the conversations we can have. And I love having conversations like this, like we're, really exploring and trying to, work something out on the fly and kind of like, what data can we bring in? What thoughts can we come? What experiences do I have that can be helpful here?
Awesome. So here's your soapbox moment. What would you like to promote?
I would love to promote, thank you, my book, Empathy Works, The Key to Competitive Advantage in the New Era of Work. And what it is really, it's empathy, basically about human-centric understanding. The book is all about the future of work and where we are and how we're needing, every single business is needing to sort of adapt to a more highly digitalized way of working that is less linear, that is, more unpredictable, all those kind of things. And the way the sort of balance of talent and technology means that we really need to be working together more closely, as I've said. So it talks about the theory, but it gets very practical with lots of empathy habits so that you can practice, like, whether it's in leadership or teamwork or hybrid working, there are lots and lots of very, very practical ways. So Empathy Works. You can also go to sophiewade.com where you can find out more about the book, and Transforming Work with Sophie Wade, which is my podcast. And I interview very many interesting people from all different types of sizes of companies. I have a very diverse group, whether it's talking about flexibility on the manufacturing shop floor or talking about skills mapping within an organization. So it's really trying to just sort of elevate interesting perspectives of people who are doing and succeeding in applying very different new ways of thinking about work and about the workplace that are successful and that I see as being the ways that sort of follow the trends of where we're going. So thank you so much for allowing me to share that.
We're really on the same wavelength with this, you and I. I'm definitely going to read your books, and you should read mine, The Spirit of Work.
Oh, yes, absolutely.
And I'm really excited about discovering your podcast. And I definitely want to be one of the regular listeners to Transforming Work podcast. And I'm so honored that you are a guest on the Culture and Leadership Connections podcast. So it's really wonderful to discover a kindred spirit.
It's wonderful. And I really appreciate you having me. And thank you you're going to love the podcast, which is just coming up. So I look forward to reading your book. And thank you again for having me on. It's been a great conversation.
Well, it's my pleasure. Are there any parting words you'd like to leave with the audience?
I think just patience, and we're in this mess together. It's a difficult time. It's difficult for everybody, but I truly see a much more positive, engaging workplace where every worker has a better fit for what they're doing. Their working life is more integrated. I do see a positive outcome, but it's going to be pretty messy for a few years. I hate to say that, but it is. But we are all in this together. So I think patience and collaboration are going to get us there.
Excellent. Lovely words to leave the audience with, and for me to resonate for the rest of the day. Thank you so much, Sophie, for being a guest today on the Culture and Leadership Connections podcast. Sophie Wade is a futurist and author of the book Empathy Works. Her family background includes a father in the BBC and mother teaching in a disadvantaged area of London, England, where social justice issues were always front and center. Home conversations centered in being curious around the world and about the world, learning about people and culture, and paying attention to context. Combined with multiple childhood and youth camping experiences across Europe in different countries, Sophie's increasing interest in culture caused her to turn to study the history and culture of China. She subsequently studied Mandarin and lived and worked in Hong Kong and Taiwan, where she finally picked up the skill of eating rice from a bowl with chopsticks without making a mess. Fast forward to her current job, Sophie now helps corporations maximize the benefits and minimize the disruption in their transition from old school ways of doing things to talent-focused, digitalized work environments. I enjoyed Sophie's bright and interesting perspective on the world and the world of work, and I loved hearing her story. If you were inspired by this episode, do share it with a friend or colleague and rate or review it right on our podcast page, where you can click on Sophie's show notes and find the rate and review icon all in one place. Go to shiftworkplace.com/podcast and scroll to Sophie Wade's interview. Thank you for listening, and may culture and leadership connections continue to guide and inspire your day. Want to show some appreciation? You can buy me a coffee. What? How do you buy a coffee for a podcast owner? Well, there's a way. Let me explain. You go to buymeacoffee.com/Marie Gervais. That's spelled MarieGervais. So it's buymeacoffee.com/Marie Gervais. And when you go to that website, what's going to happen is you'll get a chance to click on 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5 cups of coffee at $5 a piece to help contribute to the cost of the podcast. And yes, it's $5 for a cup of coffee because it's quality coffee for a quality podcast. So I hope you will contribute and you'll help us to reduce the costs of the podcast by going to buymeacoffee.com/Marie Gervais. Thank you in advance for your generous contribution.